Welcome everyone to today's training on plant pathology, where we'll discuss plant diseases, how to manage them, and how to prevent their intrusion into your landscape or garden. So first we'll start with an introduction to plant pathology. So plant pathology is the studying of suffering and diseased plants, and today we'll talk about the different types of diseases plants can suffer from and ways you can prevent and manage them in the landscape. Plants suffer from abiotic and biotic diseases. So what is an abiotic disease? An abiotic disease is an infectious organism that is not causing plant dysfunction. So this falls under two categories primarily. This would be injuries, which are physical damage to the plant itself, and disorders, which are chemical imbalances in the plant itself or imbalances caused by environmental conditions. As opposed to biotic diseases, which is an infectious organism which is causing plant dysfunction directly. So here, abiotic diseases are non-living and they are not causing plant dysfunction, whereas biotic diseases are causing plant dysfunction directly and are living. So plants can experience a number of injuries. This includes lightning strikes, which will scorch the plant itself. This also includes equipment, which can occur from mowers, mowing decks that are improperly calibrated for specific grass species. It also includes string trimmers, amongst other pieces of equipment, which will cause mechanical injury. Also, animals can burrow and cause issues with the root systems of given plants. It could be rabbits or other rodents which cause issues in this way, and they can sort of basically gnaw their way through some of the plant itself, causing harm and causing injury as well. Finally, chemicals and compaction also cause injuries to the plant. Chemicals in this way will cause injury based on a pesticide overspray, pesticide burn, sometimes using too much pressure washing, or even fertilizer burn. So fertilizer burn can occur from an excessive amount of nutrients put out into soil, which will gradually cause dieback at the tips of plants. And also through pesticide overspray, there's going to be discolorations that can arise as a result of this. Finally, compaction causes issues by limiting the amount of pore space for roots to use for air and water retention. And so in this way, there's less airflow for the roots to use for their own purposes and respiration. And also, it also limits the amount of water infiltration that can actually reach the roots themselves. Finally, is abiotic. So these injuries are abiotic in nature, so no pathogen is involved, which is different from the biotic pathogens we'll talk about in the next few slides. So we see here on the left a clear example of where mowing and line trimming can cause damage to the base of a tree. We see that the bark has been sheared off, and we see the trunk exposed now. What that can do is lead to greater issues with biotic pathogens. A lot of these abiotic pathogens can lead to biotic pathogens in the future if they are left unmanaged, if the mistake is not corrected quickly enough. And so we see on the left a pretty clear example of that. On the right, we see an example of a lightning strike, and so we see these long finger-like discolorations and necrosis throughout the entirety of this portion of the golf green. Really interesting arrangement that we have on the right as far as the way these lightning strikes look. It's very indicative and hard to confuse with other particular injuries that we have that we find in other landscapes. So these are two in particular that stick out more than the rest, but you can see how they could lead to future issues with biotic pathogens because it weakens the plant itself. So here we see on the picture on the left some superficial damage to this grass that we see, which has been damaged by herbicide. And what you see here is pretty common, is there's going to be a discoloration that results as the herbicide has either been over-applied or misapplied to a given area. And this is why it's important that we're mindful of when we're spraying any type of pesticide, and to be aware of spray drift, and to make sure we do it either in the early hours of the morning or in the evening. So we limit the amount of evaporation that takes place when we're putting out our pesticides, which will minimize the efficiency and effectiveness of the spray that you're putting out. And here on the right, we see a physical injury of, or if someone was putting off fireworks, and we see there's been some scorch marks, and this is sort of a telltale sign for unique and specific type of injury like fireworks, and you wouldn't find for a specific fungi or bacteria or any or other injuries that will create different symptoms. Talk about plant disorders. So, plant disorders can come from a myriad of causes, including temperature change, light change, water deficiency, nutrient deficiency, or air pollution. So, these diseases are caused by imbalances. The temperature changes relates to frost or heat stress. So, if plants are too hot or if it's too cold for a plant to survive, it causes a freeze event, whether it be an advective freeze or a radiative freeze. We have different freezes that will cause disorders for the plant because of an imbalance in temperature. In terms of the freeze as well, it's an imbalance related to water freezing on the plant itself. With light, the imbalance has to do with photoperiod and how a plant adjusts to different hours of the day based on its exposure to sunlight. So in terms of sun scald, so there is an issue with tomatoes and peppers as well. When they don't have enough shade for a specific fruit, sometimes there's an overexposure of this very sensitive fruiting tissue to sunlight, which causes sun scald over time and leaves a telltale discoloration around the fruit itself and is not desirable. So we want to limit these potential disorders by creating the best possible healthy plants. Other disorders would be drought and flooding. Certain plants don't like wet feet. And so because there's an abundance of water in the root zone, there's a limited amount of air exchange, which can cause suffocation and overall a dwindling mass of roots over time, or just stunting of growth. And of course, drought, which is just an imbalance of water deficiency for the plant itself. If the plant's not getting enough water, then it'll wilt. It will cause issues for the plant's maturity and development over time. Additionally, nutrition is another key imbalance we want to regulate primarily through either fertilizers or through compost or different means to make sure that there are no nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium deficiencies, and want to make sure that those macronutrients are taken care of in the plant itself. You also don't want to apply too much. You don't want to cause a toxicity on any of the plants that we're growing or ones that we have in our landscape. And so we want to make sure we have a nice balance between the nutrients that we do have available and the ones that a plant can take up. As we all know, is soil pH, which is a sort of measurement of acidity and alkalinity within soil itself, can also affect the way plants uptake certain nutrients and can affect the deficiency or toxicity that a plant can experience. So it's also important that we take soil analysis, and so we actually understand the soil pH that is present in and around our landscape, so that we can ensure that certain fertilizers we put out have nutrients that are able to be absorbed by the plant. Lastly, air pollution is another cause of some disorders for certain plants, where there's particulate matter or pollutants in a general area with plants that are maybe susceptible to these particular issues. There can be issues such as wilting or dieback in the plant itself. And so these disorders, over time, if they weaken a plant, can cause an entryway or pathway for certain biotic pathogens to become more prevalent. It's important to remember none of these are biotic pathogens in and of themselves and are merely caused by imbalances of one type or another, but can lead to biotic pathogens entrance into a plant itself. So it's important to think about disorders in the landscape as we move forward so you can properly manage them in the future and hope to limit their potential harmful impacts on the plants that you are hoping to see grow and mature. So here we see the effects of cold damage. Here on the left we find there's wilting and browning of the tissue of some of the outermost leaves here. And on the right hand side we see a yellowing of the leaves in general. And what we want to understand is the concept of right plant, right place, and sort of the Florida-friendly landscape mindset, so that we're putting plants that are adapted to the climate that they are going to grow in. That way they can proceed to full growth and maturity without having issues related to cold damage or other physical injuries. Here's a comparison of two disorders that are somewhat common. One is called edema. This is when there's too much water. Just like when we saw before, there's cold damage that causes wilting and dieback. Having too much water, just like having not enough water, can cause issues that result in dieback and discoloration around the edges of the leaves themselves, as well as just having too much water in a given area is going to attract and create a very attractive environment for fungi and insects as well, which will ultimately cause damage to the plant itself. So too much and too little water can cause disease-like symptoms. Here we see drought on the right-hand side, and this is we see dieback in the leaves themselves and sort of necrosis and chlorosis sort of swooping in because there's not enough water to maintain the vitality of the cells themselves, and so they begin to collapse and break down. And this is what causes some of the dieback that we see here. So here we see some common symptoms expressed from inadequate irrigation. We see this patch in the middle of a lawn that is clearly suffering from inadequate irrigation, inadequate watering. And on the right here we see an up-close picture of the issue with the grass itself. And so we have to understand that the plant's leaves often show the first signs of inadequate irrigation. So they'll begin to wilt or droop from a lack of moisture. And these grass blades in particular will wilt and fail to spring back up when stepped on in time, so their wear tolerance is not as good as it should be. If it was watered correctly, there would be an improved wear tolerance. So over time, the wilting becomes much more pronounced and sometimes becomes permanent. And that's why it's important for us to maintain a healthy lawn and landscape, because in its stead, what can grow up instead of grass is weeds and other plant species that we don't prefer to see in a landscape. So it's always very important that we scout to maintain good irrigation practices. Here we have a disorder that's related to manganese deficiency. So this manganese deficiency we see here in this palm tree is a bit exacerbated. On the right-hand side, we see, again, a lot of dieback. We see necrosis around the leaves and a yellowing as well as a bronzing that leads to a browning tissue in the very edges of our leaves. So this is pretty common. Sometimes this is confused for potassium deficiency, and really it's where this particular discoloration and necrosis is happening in the canopy. That's very key to remember for manganese deficiencies, also known as frizzle top on the queen palm and sago palms. Here we have another example of a disorder. This is called blossom end rot, and this is a result of calcium deficiency in tomatoes. It's also can be exacerbated by improper irrigation, and so improper irrigation and calcium deficiency often lead to what we see here, where we see a lot of necrosis, and we see black tissue all around the base of the flower on the blossom end. So key ways to avoid this particular issue, this imbalance, is to apply the right amount of calcium and to make sure we have the right amount of irrigation at all times to make sure we have the proper development for fruit. So next, let's talk about the disease triangle. This is a very key point to remember when understanding plant pathology and diseases that infect a given landscape or garden. And so really it's the combination of three conditions for a biotic disease that we have to understand. We need three conditions. It's the infectious pathogen, a susceptible host, and a conducive environment. All three of these conditions must be met at the same time in order for a biotic disease to develop. Think of infectious pathogens, perhaps think of Fusarium wilt, and if a susceptible host, let's say a watermelon that does not have any genetic resistance already attached to it, and think of a conducive environment, think of a warm and wet landscape. So these conditions would coalesce to create a Fusarium wilt infection in a watermelon patch. And so that's why it's very important that we understand why it's so key for genetic resistance to be used in our favor when we're planting certain vegetables, certain crops, or certain landscape plants to avoid the intrusion of certain biotic diseases. Here we have a list of infamous diseases of the past and present from certain crops. We're familiar with the Irish potato blight, which causes infection in the roots of the plant itself. And also we have the citrus greening issue we have here in Florida. Citrus greening has been responsible for causing a number of issues for massive citrus crops in the central and southern regions of Florida. And over time, the Asian citrus psyllid, which transports the virus, has moved from one part of Florida to the next, continually spreading the disease. So one thing that's important to remember with some of these more infamous diseases is at times there is a vector, usually an insect, that transports the disease from one area to another, and that's what helps to spread the virus. And also sometimes it's the reproductive bodies of sometimes the fungi itself. They produce through spores and are moved from one area to the next through wind. So understanding how different diseases move can also help us to limit their spread and help us to use preventative practices to mitigate any damage they may cause in the future. So plant diseases, in this case the biotic ones, are considered a disruption of normal plant function caused by an interaction between the plant and a pathogen, which is characterized by identifiable signs and/or symptoms. And so we'll break this definition down, but really want to focus on how the plant is going to be disrupted by said pathogen and talk about the characteristic signs and symptoms of each disease as we move forward. So the disease is going to disrupt the normal function of a plant. This could be disrupting how proteins are synthesized within the plant itself. It could be a disruption of photosynthesis or how nutrients or water is transported through the plant through the stem to its leaves. It could be disrupting how roots uptake water and minerals. So there's a number of different plant functions that a disease can impact to weaken the plant over time and cause a number of issues, and obviously cause shoot blight, leaf blight, or fruit rot as well. And so there's a myriad of fungi and bacteria that can cause issues. Here we see the chart on the right, see the plant and some of the issues that are caused by various diseases. So continuing with our definition of plant disease, we consider it to be a disruption of normal plant function caused by an interaction between the plant and a pathogen. And it's very important that we understand that it requires an interaction between a susceptible host and an infectious pathogen for plant disease to occur. And so in this way, we can be proactive in limiting plant disease by planting resistant varieties, ones that are resistant to different fungi, bacteria, and viruses, to limit the amount of opportunity certain pathogens will have in infecting certain plants. So here we define a pathogen as an organism capable of affecting the physiological processes of a plant thus causing disease. The main types of these pathogens are fungi, bacteria, or phytoplasm, and viruses. So plant pathogens, broken down into fungi, cause about 85% of plant diseases that are harmful to common plants that we may grow in a landscape or on a farm. Most of these reproduce by spores and are dispersed by wind or splashing water or perhaps tools or human activity. And so that's why it's very important that we keep our equipment clean, because you never know what fungal spores or what other bacteria may be latched on to our particular equipment and be spread through its movement. Also, be very mindful then of making sure that we don't have plants with any natural openings, wounds, or any mechanical injuries that were caused by our management, because these areas can be infected directly by fungi. And so some examples of fungi would be molds, mildews, and mushrooms. Here we see in the top right an example of rose black spot, as well as the fungal spores below that go hand in hand. These fungal spores can reproduce quite well, and they are very hardy to specific environments. In particular, we understand that warm and moist climates are what are most conducive for fungal spores to reproduce. So in our management strategies, what we'd like to do is to minimize the amount of warm, moist conditions that a fungi can experience. You see a picture of a flower that has plenty of water on it. As we understand from our last slide, that fungal spores germinate in the presence of high moisture and humidity. And here in Florida, those are both very common conditions for growing seasons. And so ways we can manage this, ways we can downplay the effects of high moisture and humidity, is to make sure that we don't use too much overhead watering, because what that will do is it will create moisture on the plant surface area where fungal spores can germinate. And as we understand too, heat can also exacerbate the presence of fungal spores. And so by trying to limit, if we can, the environment we're growing in by putting it in areas where It would be cooler and greater access to wind, which will dry off the plant itself. We can allow for an environment that is a bit drier, a little bit cooler as well. And so we're going to limit the amount of time fungal spores have to germinate. Next, we'll talk about bacteria. So this type of plant pathogen is smaller than fungi and is only single celled, is one cell, and reproduces by cell division and disperses mainly through water and rain. However, it can attach itself to tools and infected plants, as well as latch on to people as well. So it has to be very mindful again of the tools we use to make sure they have been properly sanitized and cleaned to make sure the bacteria are not going to be dispersed as a result of their use. And so bacteria, as we know, enters through plants through natural openings or wounds. Again, this is why it's so important that we manage our plants very carefully and do not add any particular mechanical injuries or cause any harm to them, because these are points of entry for bacteria as well, can cause some very big issues for us in the future. And so these are extremely contagious, and oftentimes they can also require sometimes an insect as a host for dispersal and entry. As we talked about before, with the Asian citrus psyllid, this passes on citrus greening and is a primary vector for the disease. So, fungi versus bacteria. So things to remember that fungi cause the majority of plant diseases. It causes about 85% of plant diseases that we want to mitigate in our respective environments. And so that's why it's important for us to understand the way they reproduce, and also respective fungicides that we like to use, or preventative measures before we use fungicides to make sure that we limit the amount of intrusion that fungi has in our landscapes. Secondly, bacterial diseases are very infectious and more difficult to control. This is because there's far fewer bactericides on the market, or curative measurements for bacterial infections. Fungi, there are a few more options for landscapers, for farmers, and for our residential growers. And also understand that most fungal and bacterial diseases are promoted by high temperatures and humidity. So it's very key to understand we can be proactive in limiting the spread of fungi or bacteria in a given environment by trying to reduce the amount of moisture and the amount of heat that our particular gardens will experience, or particular landscapes will experience, because these temperatures and humidity will only promote fungal and bacterial disease. So here we see from this diagram, we see on the far right hand side a spore of a fungi. Next to that, an aprosorium, which is a cushion for said fungal spores, as a cushion for direct penetration. To the left of that, we see bacteria on water film, which was carried over by a leafhopper. And we see the bacteria and the spores slowly infiltrating through the cellular walls of the leaf tissue. And on the right-hand side for the spore, you'll see where there are hyphae, these long finger-like tissue structures that the fungi will produce to slowly infect leaf tissue. And we see here on next to that the aprosorium, that's sort of creating a structure for the hyphae to build from. And so the leaf epidermis, the leaf itself, will slowly be infected by the spores as the hyphae begin to grow. And on the left-hand side, we see that the leafhopper was carrying this bacteria, and it has found its way through a crack in the leaf tissue. And so this is an example of leaf injury, and this is where bacteria can find their way in once there is a break in the particular leaf tissue, the cell walls. And so the bacteria as well will begin to slowly infect leaf tissue as time goes on. So very important to remember, we want to limit mechanical injury or any particular injuries that would cause openings in leaf tissue or other tissue that would be made vulnerable to bacteria or fungi. And also important to understand that leafhoppers and other insects can carry some of these diseases, and by minimizing the pest incidence of a leafhopper or other insects, you are simultaneously going to limit the amount of vectoring that can occur for bacteria or other diseases. Finally, we'll talk about viruses. These are the smallest of the three pathogens and must have a living host to reproduce. So here we see in the top right-hand corner the viral particles of a tobacco mosaic virus, a very common disease with multiple hosts infecting several common vegetables as well as tobacco. These are usually spread by insects, but also mites nematodes, fungi, and people. So viruses can attach themselves to a variety of vectors and find their way to plants through multiple means. They can also enter through wounds made by said vectors. So if an insect is feeding on a leaf or feeding on a plant in particular, what can happen is viruses can use this wound, this injury on leaf tissue or shoot tissue to infect the plant. They'll find their way into the plant via these wounds. So like I mentioned before, very important that we understand that insect pest management and disease management are somewhat tied together based on vectoring and the movement of these diseases through insects. Again, continuing with our definition of plant disease, is a disruption of normal plant function caused by an interaction between a plant and a pathogen, a susceptible plant and an infectious pathogen, which is characterized by identifiable signs and or symptoms. So next we'll talk about signs and symptoms and the differences between them. So in this case, signs are the actual pathogen parts. It's the actual reproductive bodies themselves. It's the spores, conchs, mushrooms, the mold themselves. Whereas the symptoms are how plants express the disease. It's the reaction to the presence of a pathogen. So symptoms are going to be the reaction of the actual pathogen parts, and how this plant expresses said reaction is known as the symptom. And this way, it could be leaf spots, patches, dieback, necrosis, or discoloration of leaf or shoot tissue, whereas the signs is the physical manifestation of the pathogen itself. So your spores, mushrooms would be an example. So that's the key difference between signs and symptoms. It's also important to know that symptoms of fungal and bacterial diseases are often very similar, whereas signs are more distinctive. So when we're trying to identify different pathogens, be it fungal or bacterial, it's very important that we not only focus on the symptoms, the things we see the plant expressing as a result of the disease, but that we also pay attention to what signs are present and identify our fungal and bacterial diseases by the actual pathogen parts as well. So signs are physical evidence of the pathogen in association with unhealthy plant tissue. So there are numerous examples of this. Think of fungal mycelium, which would be the mildew or the mold that we see from a fungi. So that would be powdery mildew would be a good example. Gray mold on strawberries would be another example. Fungal fruiting bodies, think of sclerotia or rust spores. So think of any corn rust you may have seen. That's an actual sign of the fungus that you're looking at, not a symptom. Next we can look at bacterial ooze or odors, bacterial streaming or water-soaked leaf spots in the early stages of bacterial infection. These are all signs of a given infection, whereas viral diseases don't have signs, they only have symptoms. So if you notice that we are having issues with a particular landscape plant or in a particular field, and you don't notice any signs, it's very possible that it's a virus because these don't have any particular signs to identify them by. However, fungal and bacterial diseases do. So on the top left, we see the example of powdery mildew. And so this is a sign, this white talcum powder growth of a fungal mycelium is what's present. And we see the same thing on the bottom right-hand side of the slide with squash on the underside of the leaves. So if when we're looking at leaves for signs and symptoms, be sure to inspect thoroughly so we are finding anything that might be on the underside of each respective leaf that may tell us more about maybe an insect that's present that may be vectoring certain diseases, or maybe telling us about a certain sign that is not necessarily always available on the top of the leaves that we see. So make sure we turn things over and make sure we inspect and scout very thoroughly to make sure we have a full comprehensive view and analysis of what particular infection may be present in our fields. Here we have an example of sclerotinia stem rot fungus on tomato. These have hard seed-like sclerotia within the stem itself. And what sclerotia are compact masses of mycelium, often spherical or pellet-shaped, that range they're very small in diameter, normally less than 1 centimeter, and consist of a central core of hyphae, as we talked about. And so these are very unique signs to distinguish for fungi, but in this case, it's very useful when trying to identify what type of disease is present in a field. So by using signs to our advantage in identifying them, we can help to streamline the process for using curative or perhaps in the future preventative measures of control for fungi and bacteria. Here we have another example of a fungus. This one is the geranium rust fungus, and a sign here that's key to identify is the rust-colored spores. So these are reproductive bodies from which the fungi will reproduce from, and so it's important to understand that we have these characteristic signs that go with certain fungi that help us to identify them. And here in the top left portion, you see from a distance, this looks like a discoloration or perhaps a water-soaked lesion. It may be confused with another fungi or another bacteria. But if we get up very close, we can see these raised spores, these spores that are raised above the plant tissue themselves. And so these raised edges, these reproductive bodies that we see, are what are most indicative of certain types of fungi. And so when we're looking to identify fungi or bacteria in a given environment, it's very important that we look for details within signs so that we can understand which fungi or bacteria that we have identified. Here we have bacterial wilt of tomato, and so we see this bacterial streaming on the top left side. And what this is these are small string-like strands that form between tissue within the stem of this particular tomato. When you cut a cross section of it, you'll notice that if you gently pull them apart, you'll notice these hair-like strands that connect them. This is bacterial streaming and a telltale sign of bacterial wilt. In the bottom right here, we see water-soaked lesions and oozes, and this is bacterial spot of Malenga. And so this is a type of ooze. You'll see these little droplets that are all around this type of particular leaf. And so when we're identifying bacteria, we have to make sure we understand the signs that each particular bacteria will exhibit when they have infected given hosts. Bacterial decay is often associated with a bad odor. And so the sign in this case would be a bad smell. So if you notice a certain odor or a certain smell you haven't had in the past in a given landscape or garden, it's possible that there's a bacterial issue. So this bacterial issue that you have resulting in a bad odor comes from the fact that fungi and bacteria are both living organisms. And bacteria in this case will begin to decompose plant matter, be it root or shoot tissue. And as they do, they engage in chemical processes which will release a foul smell. So it's important that we not only use our eyes to distinguish a particular disease from our garden or from our landscape, but also use other senses that we have to determine whether or not there is a bacterial issue at hand, or if there may be other forces at play that are causing issues in our garden or landscape. So in review, signs are physical evidence of the pathogen itself. There are numerous examples of this. Fungal mycelium, which is another way of saying a mildew or a mold. Fungal fruiting bodies, be it sclerotia, rust spores, conchs, and mushrooms. Bacterial oozes, odors, streaming, or water-soaked lesions are signs of a fungal or a bacterial disease, whereas viruses do not have any signs of physical evidence. They have no signs at all. So if you see a sign of a disease, it is going to be a fungal or bacterial issue. But if you see no signs, it's possible that a viral disease has infected some of your plants in your landscape or in your garden. So in this case, we want to be very mindful and use our ability as master gardeners to identify different issues, be it mildew or mold, and use that information to identify specific fungi or bacteria before they become too much of an issue in our garden or landscape. So now let's talk about symptoms. We talked about signs, which are the actual pathogen parts. These are the spores, the conchs, and the mushrooms. However, the symptoms are how the plant expresses the disease. So this is a reaction to the signs, a reaction to the pathogen itself. And this can be expressed as a leaf spot, a patch, or dieback, or even just is decaying and discolored tissue, which is the symptom itself. So plant reaction is the basis for symptoms that we'll talk about today. Have a symptom. These are leaf spots, and leaf spot is a common descriptive term applied to a number of diseases affecting the foliage of ornamentals, shade trees, fruit, and vegetables as well. The majority of leaf spots are caused by fungi, but some are caused by bacteria. The chief symptom of a leaf spot is we see spots on the foliage. The spots will vary in size and color depending on the plant affected, the specific organism involved, and the stage of development. Spots are normally brownish but may be tan or black, and concentric rings or dark margins are often present. Fungal bodies may appear as black dots within these spots, either in the rings or in the central cluster. Over time, spots may combine or enlarge to form blotches. These are sometimes angular, in which case they are generally referred to as anthracnose. Some preventative measurements we can take are to remove infected leaves and dead twigs and to keep foliage dry to limit the amount of moisture content that's available for these fungi and bacteria to infect said foliage. See a common example of leaf blight, and this is actually when spots grow and coalesce. So you'll see in the bottom right hand corner a particular leaf spot. And what happens, leaf spots will start as these small brown spots, often with a yellow halo, and then grow into these irregular brown spots. These leaf spots sometimes develop a target-like pattern of rings, and these severely infected leaves turn brown, curl upward, wither, and then suffer from dieback. So this is what causes leaf blight in the future. And so we see here the telltale sign, the differences between leaf spot and leaf blight being a progression oftentimes of different leaf spots. It's important to remember that many things can cause spots and blights. A plant with a spot or a dead patch in a lawn does not always indicate a disease problem, as we see in the bottom left corner here, where potassium deficiency has created a number of leaf spots on foliage. On this particular palm is an issue of nutritional deficiency. It'd be an abiotic disorder. And then on this right-hand side, we see in a lawn where chinch bug damage has caused quite a bit of issues. We notice that this is from an insect pressure, not from a disease. So not all of these leaf spots and leaf blights that we see come from fungal or bacterial means. That's why it's very important we understand how to identify signs as well as symptoms to determine whether or not a particular spot or blight is a result of a disease or if it's a result of an insect pressure or a nutritional deficiency. Here we have two more symptoms to discuss. One is fruit spots and the other is fruit rots. On the left-hand side, we see peppers that have been infected by Xanthomonas as a bacterial spot, which creates these circle-like patterns, these rings all over the fruit, which you see on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we see fruit rot, which is causing this gray, browning necrotic tissue, which is sort of oozing in the plant itself. And these are both two good indicators that there's a pathogen that has infected this plant tissue. And so it's very important that we take proactive measurements to limit the intrusion of particular pathogens like these in a landscape. I have another symptom. This is a gall or a tumor. We see it's the rose crown gall. And what a gall is, they are characterized by a spongy, rough, pinhead to golf ball sized tumor-like swelling that becomes brown and woody, becomes knotted with age. So this disease is caused by soil-borne bacteria, in this case agrobacterium, that infect the plant only through specific wounds. The wounds are the result of natural causes, be it insect feeding or frost damage, or from mechanical causes such as pruning, cultivation, or harvesting. So it's key to remember that this bacteria is overwintering in the soil and in the galls itself. And the best control measure is prevention. So plant only certified disease-free nursery stock and take care not to wound the plants, especially the root systems at planting time. Make sure you try to only plant in sites where there's no history of the disease itself, or if you do find history of the disease, wait at least 3 to 5 years before replanting in the specific site. If a plant that is diseased or infected is detected, remove and burn the roots and tops of the plants. It's important that we destroy this plant tissue so that further infection is prevented in the future. Here we have another symptom called stem canker, otherwise known as a sunken lesion on the stems and branches of certain plants. In particular, on the right, we see citrus canker, which is a citrus disease caused by the bacteria Xanthomonas. And while not harmful to humans, cankers like this significantly affect the vitality of citrus trees, causing leaves and fruit to prematurely drop. The bacteria that causes citrus canker enter leaves through stomata or wounds caused by weather damage or insects, such as the citrus leaf miner. Controlling citrus cankers, we can do so proactively by removing diseased parts of the tree itself during dry weather, growing adapted or resistant varieties in warm, well-drained, fertile soil, and avoiding overcrowding within the canopy and overwatering as well to limit moisture from aiding the growth and proliferation of the citrus canker. So here we have a symptom. This is wilting foliage and on the left side and a discolored xylem on the right side. So a xylem, that is just the plant tissue that moves water throughout a plant. And on the left side we have wilting foliage. It's a bacterial disease, it's bacterial wilt we see in this particular tomato. And so there are numerous wilt diseases we see for vegetables and fruits that cause significant harm to our plants in our given landscape or garden. And so it's important that we recognize this is a symptom, not a physical sign of a disease itself. So here we have a symptom of a virus, and this is called mosaic. So this is just a pattern of dark and light colors that are all over a particular leaf or fruit. And so we see this sort of splotchy coloration that we would not normally see if a plant was healthy, and this is squash mosaic virus. Another type of mosaic virus is called cucumber mosaic virus, which may spread from infected to healthy plants through physical means, mechanically, or through insects like aphids feeding on given plants that are already infected, also through grafting. So vegetative propagation can also perpetuate certain types of mosaic virus. Symptoms vary within each species, but some symptoms associated with mosaic virus infections include stunting, a mosaic pattern of light and dark green or yellow and green on the leaves and some fruits, as we see here, yellow streaking on the leaves, and also flower, we see ring spot or line patterns on leaves or fruits, and distinct yellowing only of certain veins. All of these are characteristic signs of potential mosaic virus. So viruses in general carry unique symptoms with them that are usually very different from bacterial and fungal infections. So if you see something that's amiss or something that's particularly odd in terms of the coloration of your plants, or you see something that's amiss in your fields or in your garden or landscape itself that you haven't seen before, something that's really an anomaly, it's possible that it's a viral infection. Here we have another virus symptom, which is characteristically stunted and distorted growth. We see on the leaves there is this curling of sorts that's going on in the left-hand picture, and on the right-hand side the same thing. The outer edges of the leaves are curling in a direction that's not typical of a vital plant. And so we have to understand this is a symptom of the virus. There are no signs associated with this. So when we're trying to identify viral symptoms, it's important that we look for special anomalies we wouldn't normally see with a bacterial or fungal disease or from a nutritional deficiency or an insect pressure. So with viral symptoms, we have to be very careful and make sure we are scouting continually to look for key symptoms such as a stunted or distorted growth like we see here in the left and right hand pictures. Another virus symptom we find on leaves and on fruits are these ring spots. And so you'll notice these are sort of concentric rings that form very interesting patterns along leaves and fruits and are very characteristics of viruses, in this case on the right-hand side of viruses only. So you will not see a bacteria or fungus make these ring-shaped structures in the way you see on the right-hand side here especially. So very key, we are looking for symptoms with viruses. There are no signs associated with them, so we are only left to be guided by symptoms. In this case, ring spots are one key way we can distinguish between a virus and or a bacterial or fungal disease. So let's review. So pathogen signs would include, in the top left corner, we see molds, so downy mildew or powdery mildew as we talked about. Also conchs, so this sort of these bodies that we see, these reproductive bodies we see around the base of a tree. Sclerotia, which are these seed-like or pod-like reproductive structures. You can see in the top right-hand corner the dark shapes within inside the tissue itself. Mushrooms, oozes, and also bacterial streaming are all signs of a pathogen. They're the physical manifestation of the disease itself. This is not the reaction that the plant is having to the pathogen, it is the pathogen. So pathogen signs are key for us to determine what type of fungal or bacterial disease we're dealing with, and also to distinguish between a bacterial and a fungal disease from a viral disease. Because again, viral diseases do not have pathogen signs, they only exhibit symptoms. So here we have the pathogen symptoms, and in review, some key pathogen symptoms to recognize are leaf and fruit spots, rots that we find in fruits and roots, also blights that we see in leaves and flowers, and overall wilt. So this would be examples of symptoms. These are the reactions of the plant to said disease. These are not the signs of the pathogen themselves, just a symptom of what exists on the plant. And so it's very important for us when we're scouting to understand the differences between signs and symptoms so we can create an accurate picture, an accurate analysis for a particular disease that we have in our given landscape or garden. Next, we'll dive into the second part of this lecture, which is under plant disease management. So plant disease management will talk about proactive ways for you to manage disease before it progresses to later stages of development, how to use cultural, biological, and mechanical means to limit the intrusion of disease, and also how to deal with disease once it becomes a part of a landscape. So now that we've learned how to identify disease, it's crucial that we understand how to manage it. So we'll talk about the plant disease triangle and review some of the concepts we talked about before regarding how conducive environment, plant pathogens, and susceptible hosts are connected. So in review, this is the plant disease triangle. We talked about this earlier in this presentation. And as I mentioned, there are three conditions required at the same time in order for a biotic disease to function most optimally. So the infectious pathogen must interact with a susceptible host in a conducive environment for a biotic disease to thrive in a given landscape or garden. So it's very important that we understand that by limiting one of these three factors or by eliminating it altogether, we will limit the spread of biotic diseases. So pathogens in this case, which would be harmful, would be either viral, bacterial, or fungal pathogens, which can infect certain hosts that don't have any genetic resistance. So by creating an environment where we have genetically resistant hosts, or by planting a diverse array of species in a landscape, we can limit the amount of intrusion that a pathogen will have in a given landscape or garden, because pathogens typically have a difficult time establishing themselves in areas with diverse arrays of plants, because certain pathogens typically infect only certain families of plants and will have a hard time infecting plant tissue from multiple plant families. And as long as we also have proactive measurements in place, cultural practices in place that limit the ability for this pathogen to thrive on a host in a conducive environment, we can limit its spread in a given landscape. So in essence, our goal is to disrupt the disease triangle, to exclude the pathogen, use disease-resistant plants, and to alter the plant environment. One way we can do this in tomatoes is by altering the plant environment to emphasize airflow. So airflow is going to help to promote a drier environment for the plant itself and will help to dry off some perhaps overly wet leaf tissue. So by removing excessive branching or extensive suckers from a tomato garden perhaps, or tomato plants themselves, you will limit the amount of excessive surface area to which a pathogen may actually take hold of and reproduce on. So by limiting the amount of surface area that a particular pathogen can infect, we're going to alter the plant environment to limit its intrusion in the first place. So the three main categories you want to focus on: excluding the pathogen, using disease-resistant plants, and altering the plant environment are key cornerstones for plant disease management. So two ways we can exclude the pathogen are by not bringing it home through infected plants or through infected soil media, or we can sanitize tools as well to exclude the pathogen. So we want to make sure we sanitize tools and we want to make sure we're getting the best possible clean stock available so we don't unnecessarily bring plant disease into the environment. Make sure we're thoroughly sanitizing tools to make sure that every portion of surface area that could potentially be infected by a dormant or active pathogen is sterilized. So make sure we're not bringing it home through infected plants and that we are sanitizing tools to minimize the ability for a pathogen to enter our environment. So next we'll talk about susceptible hosts, and plant disease management relies on, if we can, using genetically resistant varieties such as Kentucky Wonder, which is a rust-resistant type of pole bean, which helps us to minimize certain types of fungal outbreaks. There are also many others. Think of downy mildew-resistant sun patience, and also powdery mildew-resistant Appalachia crepe myrtle. So there are some key fungal infections that we can prohibit and stop from the beginning by using disease-resistant varieties that are not susceptible to certain fungi or bacterial infection. So make sure we carefully read the labels of the transplants or the seeds we're getting to make sure that we don't have any particular issues with fungi or bacteria in the future. So in plant disease management, one key aspect of our management plan will be to alter the environment when we can. So while we can't control the weather, be it rainfall, temperature, humidity, what we can do is manage cultural practices. We can use the concept of right plant, right place to put the correct plants in our respective environments that meet the environmental conditions that surround them. And also we can use irrigation and fertilization appropriately to make sure that best management practices are followed. It's also important that we prune diseased and or crowded plants, and so this is to maximize airflow throughout a particular canopy or throughout the area that plants are put in, so that way there's greater potential for drying the surface area that could potentially be infected by diseases. So we also want to improve drainage because we know that there are soil bacteria also below ground which can infect root systems and cause just as much damage as bacteria and fungi on plant leaf tissue. It's also important that we rotate vegetable crops. And so if you think about this, this is in regards to how certain fungi and bacteria will infect a certain family of vegetable crops or may have multiple hosts. And so by rotating vegetable crops, what we can do is we can minimize the outbreaks of fungi and bacteria in subsequent seasons by limiting the amount of food that we give them, the amount of tissue that is able to be infected by the given fungi or bacteria. Also, we can use pesticides preventatively. Optimally, we want to use ones that have the least amount of incidence, the least amount of potential to cause harm to an ecosystem. So we want to use ones that are going to have the greatest effect in managing bacteria or fungi without causing issues to the local ecosystems. We want to use pesticides responsibly and preventatively. And also we can use mulch to reduce splashing because, as we talked about before, reducing moisture is a key to altering the environment in our favor to prevent any incidents of bacteria or fungi in our environment. Next, we'll talk about advising clients and some of the questions you should be asking when a particular client may ask you about diseases in their own landscape. And so while you won't handle necessarily commercial clients, if you do have issues, if a commercial client does contact you as a master gardener, please refer them to your county's extension agent and he or she can help with their respective issues. However, if you do have people ask you questions about respective issues regarding bacterial or fungal diseases they may have in their landscape and when you need to advise them or give them tips or management techniques, strategies that they could use, we'll talk about some of the key questions you can ask to glean the information you'll need to give them the best information possible from the University of Florida, and so that way they can use this information to their benefit. So as a Master Gardener volunteer, you may volunteer at your respective county office, or you may be asked to help certain homeowners or some residential clients with disease problems. And so what's key is that we ask problems that are going to lead to descriptive and informative answers to give us the information we need to identify the disease. Step one is always going to be to identify the disease present from a particular homeowner or client that may require information from you. I want to make sure we ask the right questions to identify the disease. And so we're going to start by asking which plant is infected, what is the plant itself, where is the plant growing on your property, because certain conditions will exacerbate the populations of certain fungi or bacteria. We want to make sure we know, is the sample typical? So has this person noticed similar issues like this in the past, or is this an anomaly that they've experienced for the first time or haven't experienced for some time, maybe months or years? I also want to know, when did the symptoms appear? So certain bacteria and fungal disorders will progress rapidly over the course of a few days, while others would take weeks. And so understanding how long it's taken for certain symptoms to appear can tell us, one, at what stage of maturity was this problem noticed, at what stage of maturity is it currently experiencing now in a given landscape or garden, and at what level of maturity is the fungi or bacterial at specifically, so that way we can inform clients on how to address that issue, be it through fungicides or through perhaps proactive or management strategies that will apply to early maturity diseases. We can also ask about cultural practices and what the particular homeowner has used in the past to tackle said diseases that may be recurring in their given environment. Or we can talk about other recent occurrences that they've had with a given disease, or perhaps any patterns they've noticed on their property, which will tell us more about the disease itself. Because all of these are meant to, all these questions are meant to help us identify the disease, the conditions causing the disease, and identify the management techniques that will alter the conditions causing the disease. So once we have identified the disease, we should ask more questions about how the conditions in the specific area are either causing or aiding and abetting said disease. And then finally, we want to identify the management techniques that will alter the conditions causing the disease. So we want to understand cultural practices that perhaps the client has been using to try to manage the disease itself. So that way we compare that with our own knowledge to give them advanced steps to handle said fungi or bacterial issues in their lawn or landscape or garden. It's important that we remember when we're helping clients that susceptible hosts for a particular disease are limited in a diverse landscape. And that's because susceptible hosts for a particular disease are usually members of the same species, genus, or plant family. And so we can imagine that if we plant many different species or many different plants from different plant families, we're going to limit the amount of tissue that is able to be infected by an infectious pathogen. We're going to limit the amount of area that a particular infectious pathogen could possibly use to its own advantage. Finally, when different species suffer the same symptoms, the cause is usually abiotic. So if we find that different species are suffering from what looks like the same particular problem, normally this is not because of a biotic pathogen, it's because of an abiotic issue, be it frost, chemical injury, or otherwise. Another important step in helping clients, really the single best method for controlling diseases, is to prevent them. And that's by using good cultural practices and applying fungicides preventatively and thoroughly. It's important to remember that chemicals do not eliminate existing symptoms, i.e. they will not, if leaf spots won't disappear on already infected growth, but new growth will be healthy. And also remember that some diseases do not have any control methods. So if we think of tobacco mosaic virus, certain viruses have no particular cure, and so if they are noticed at an advanced stage of development, it's best to advise the grower or client that there is no advisable treatment for this particular crop, and so it's best to either till it in or to manage other areas of a particular property before they are susceptible to said infection. Very important to remember, the label is the law. Pesticide labels must be followed even by homeowners for personal, environmental, and plant safety. So the site for application must be on the label, so therefore it must be used for turf, or must be used for ornamentals, or for fruits and vegetables. Understand the label is the most important aspect of using pesticides because it will give you the requisite information you need to apply said pesticide in the best possible way, so that way you can apply it effectively and efficiently. Also remember, it is better to make no diagnosis than to make the wrong diagnosis for a client, especially if it's a valuable specimen or pesticides are required. Also important to know that if pesticides are required, it's important to inquire if a client or the specific pesticide applicator has the requisite pesticide license to apply said pesticide. If you are in doubt or you have questions about this, please advise the client to submit a disease sample to the IFAS Disease Diagnostic Lab if it truly is in need of particular pesticide application. So now we'll talk about submitting a disease sample. So samples can be sent to a UF diagnostic clinic where you can properly identify which disease is harming specific plants in your landscape. So if you've gone through the steps we talked about today and you are not able to identify said plant disease through the symptoms and signs that we've talked about already, you can take a sample and send it off to the UF diagnostic lab for analysis. And so the sample should arrive at the diagnostic lab looking like it did in the landscape or garden. It's important then to maintain the moisture around the root system. Other tissues should not be placed inside the plastic bags. We want to make sure that we are maintaining the integrity of the plant so that it can be properly identified by specialists at the UF diagnostic clinic. And then response will include disease management info as well as the particular plant disease that has infected the tissue you have sent in. So when submitting a disease sample, advise your client to make sure that samples exhibit the progression of symptoms that they are seeing, that they have a leaf spot or leaf blight or a severely diseased plant. Make sure that there is a progression of symptoms exhibited by the samples that they retrieve or collect for analysis. And also make sure that images illustrating the overall symptoms and close-ups of the disease itself on the plant are used or given to UF Diagnostic Lab. It's also important that you advise your client to completely fill out the form that is given here on the right, to make sure they provide as much background information as possible, because any background information that can be given regarding either management practices or when the disease was noticed in the first place or the overall progression of the disease itself is going to be critical in using that information to identify the disease and also give a management plan to the client themselves. So if they need more forms or more information, please advise them to go to the link below at planpath.ifas.ufl.edu to get more information. I'd like to thank you all for attending today's training on plant pathology. If you have any questions about today's training, please contact me at lukemiller1@ufl.edu. I am the horticulture and small farms agent in Bradford County. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks again for attending today's training.